Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here to speak with you about the new social contract. But before the new social contract, I just want to say one thing, which is that corporations today, the private sector, are between 2/3 and 3/4 of the economy and jobs. In the US, it is actually 3/4. How they relate to society and to us as citizens is therefore essential and actually a very important part of the social contract. So I have a small movie which was done for my website, Corporation 2020, by MoFilm, which is a crowdsourcing event management site. And I'd like us to see this movie. It's about 50 seconds to tell you what they think of today's social contract.
A corporation is accountable to the society in which it was created. It is not exempt from taxes, nor from the law. It doesn't interfere with government for its own benefit, because its interests do not supersede those of the whole. A corporation is willing to find a compromise between what it wants and what's good for the environment. It exists for the net gain of all people, not the privileged few. It does this because it has the foresight to understand that a healthy economy can only exist in a healthy society. A corporation understands that self-restraint isn't just good ethics, but a wise business strategy too, because it knows that success isn't limited to quarterly profits. Of all the things I've told you, how many of them are true? Think about it.
Let's think about it. And that's really what today's conversation with you is about. It's the new social contract. But it will replace actually what is a very evolved and old social contract, because the corporation is not by any means a new creature. It has existed for more than 2,500 years, from the Sreni in ancient India to the Societas Publicanorum in Rome. The idea of the corporation was born to be able to share risk and to pool capital and to do things which the government wasn't very good at doing. And for example, building bridges, collecting taxes, effectively doing business, but on a large scale. So in those days, the corporation clearly had a social purpose. Its purpose was to do what the government or the king wanted. And it was given a license, basically a royal charter, to do so. Today, in Sweden, Stora Kopparberg is the oldest corporation still in existence under the name Stora Enso. And of course, the corporations evolved, and it's debatable whether, depending on whose side you take, whether the East India Company, which was also a corporation, did good or bad. Well, for the British, it probably did good. As an Indian, I might have to disagree. But finally, in 1720, with the Bubble Act, basically because of the South Sea bubble and the constraints on creating corporations for private purpose, all changed. Action in the UK stopped, in Europe stopped, and action moved to the United States, where in 1820, effectively the idea of limited liability, the idea also of corporate personhood was born. Through legislation, the corporation became a person. Through legislation further in the 1840s, that person was recognized as a citizen. And finally, with the legislation of the states of Jersey and Delaware in the 1870s and 1890s, effectively, you could have a corporation which was no longer constrained by time. In other words, for 30 years, I will build a rail road to Manchester. By space, as in I will operate in this location or that. Or by purpose. It could do anything, anywhere, for any length of time. Such was the increase in the powers of the corporation created by individuals, and you could, as an individual now, incorporate a company. It didn't have to be a king or a government to do so. As a result of these changes, from just 350 corporations in the US in the early 1800s, the number grew to almost 500,000 by the 1890s. And finally, if there was any doubt as to what was the purpose of the corporation, this was sealed by a court case called the Dodge versus Ford court case. This was in the Michigan High Court, where Henry Ford was challenged by the Dodge brothers, 10% shareholders, as to why he never paid dividends but reinvested in creating a bigger and bigger company and cheaper cars, because that's what he wanted. He wanted every American to have a Model T. And interestingly enough, the court ruled in favor of the Dodge brothers and more or less rebuked Henry Ford, the great arch industrialist, saying that, Mr. Ford, you should know better than to work against the interests of your shareholders. So shareholder capitalism was born. Basically what I called Corporation 1920 was born. the corporation whose main purpose was profit for its shareholders, the corporation whose model has become the multinational corporation, which pursues size because that's the way to get higher volumes and more profits, who actively lobbies, and we know how long, for instance, the fossil fuel lobby and has been doing so for keeping lead in petrol, almost 70 years from the time that its health costs were discovered to the time when it was banned. And using advertising preying upon human insecurities, converting our needs into wants, wants into demand, demand into production. So this cycle has been actually the model of today's successful corporation. And this really is what that movie is talking about. A corporation which has disconnected social purpose, a corporation which does not anymore exist for people without actually a meaningful social contract. What does this mean? And what does it lead to? It leads to what we economists call negative externalities. Essentially, you have become so focused on generating private profits that you do so at the cost of public losses, which means profits are ours, costs are yours. And this externalization of costs, this cost to society of doing business as usual, is not small. A recent estimate was made in 2010 of the externalities, the third-party costs of doing business as usual, of the top 3,000 listed companies around the world. And that answer was more than $2 trillion, which means $2 million, 3.5% of global GDP. These are the usual suspects, and with the usual activities, which include, of course, emissions of greenhouse gases and those costs, freshwater extraction, pollutants, poisons, etc., all of those costs, the health costs, and the consequences of climate change. But one of the interesting reasons why this is a problem, not just a nice academic subject in economics on chapter 11 of some textbook. One of the reasons is that A, it is big, we are talking about trillions of dollars, but B, because in fact, if you look at these externalities, we're talking about drivers such as greenhouse gas emissions, water abstraction, and natural resource use. These externalities are actually 6 out of the 9 main drivers of our blind progression towards planetary boundaries. These planetary boundaries, a science which was produced by the Stockholm Resilience Center and others, and disclosure, I am a board member of the SRC. But these planetary boundaries are exactly meant to be limits within which we as society need to operate. Unfortunately, as you can see, we've exceeded in those 3 red triangles. You can see we've exceeded planetary boundaries, at least in climate, biodiversity, and nitrogen, and we are approaching them in others. And this is the challenge of the global environment no longer being a safe place for our future generations. Hence, once again, the social contract of corporations becomes essential here. How do we ensure that this has not got to happen anymore? Well, the theory of change, and apologies for this rather busy slide, because it's in fact a one-slide summary of my book, which the good news is you don't have to buy anymore. So the theory of change here is that we are facing numerous challenges, but actually there are 4 big challenges at the macro level in terms of there is too much demand, excessive demand, and it's at too cheap prices, essentially because of externalities not being priced, and because the costs of recessions, of financial recessions not being priced, and indeed the cost of resources which are scarce not being reflected in prices. But also we are facing resource depletion. We're talking about issues with phosphorus. We are also, of course, facing public capital losses, because when we talk externalities, that's a nice sort of demure economic term, but what it means is, as a company, I make profits, as a citizen, you make losses. So these are public capital losses in terms of society, in terms of nature, in terms of the environment. And we have to recognize they've just gotten too big. But interestingly enough, all of these 4 macro issues have got a micro driver. By that I mean at the corporate level. And it's the micro driver that gives us both the challenge as well as the opportunity. The challenge because, as I mentioned earlier, today's social contract isn't there. The corporation is there for its purpose, its profits, its shareholders. But the opportunity is, can we change it? Because the corporation is, at the end of the day, it's a creature as we have imbued it with life and we have imbued it with personhood. It is a creature, and like every species, it responds to its environment. So it will evolve if we change the environment of the corporation. But what is the environment of the corporation? Policies, prices, institutions. So the question to really ask in the theory of change is, which policies, what prices, and which institutions do we need to amend in order to create the corporation a new pathway towards sustainability within a green economy, and to deliver in a manner which respects society, adds public wealth whilst creating private profits, not the opposite. So when we do that assessment, we find that actually there are, in fact, drivers at each of these levels. When we talk about demand, it's about consumerism, and it's about advertising and marketing pushing that consumerism, and then the ethics of advertising and what we need to do there. We talk about leveraging, as in financial recessions. The last 4 recessions basically created by excessive leverage, abuse of leverage, or inappropriate use of leverage. We still have that going on. We still have central bankers pumping the economy with too much money. I was just sharing at lunch a joke about how the economy is like a patient with a drinking problem, and what do we do as central bankers? Inject more alcohol into the patient. But that's basically the problem which we have to address and can address, the so-called too big to fail. Today, companies are becoming too big to fail. We've seen banks too big to fail. Not just that. Insurance companies, AIG, not just that. Car companies, General Motors, too big to fail. Airlines, Swissair. And of course, not to forget, a hedge fund too big to fail, which many bankers, including my old employers, came to the rescue of, LTCM. So this concept of allowing markets to punish the misallocation of capital, the fundamentals of economic behavior and market behavior, clearly does not in fact happen in practice. So these are the things that we have to address, but these are all issues at the micro level. These are the nuts and bolts of the corporation, the nuts and bolts of the private sector, which we have to change. And there are strategies, and this is just, for example, what strategies do we need to adopt? Well, point of sale advertising needs to include lifespan of the product, needs to disclose its countries of origin, so you know where what's happening, needs to show how to dispose the product, needs to disclose its footprint, has been done. Resource taxation, as I talked about. If you want to get prices right for resources, you need to ensure that you're not just taxing the goods, as in corporate ingenuity and corporate innovation, and therefore tax value addition and corporate profits. You need to tax the bads, resource extraction. This is not theory, ladies and gentlemen. It's happened. Norway has been taxing oil extraction at 79% of the value of the oil. And when I asked Erik Solheim, this interview is there on my website, when I asked him, don't you have a problem with the oil companies? Won't they go away? Aren't they complaining? He just laughed. He says, yes, they've been complaining for the last 25 years. They're still here. That was his answer. So this too is possible. Disclosing externalities, everyone tells you, and probably still tells you, this is too complicated, too difficult. Well, here's a gentleman, Jochen Zeitz, then executive chairman of Puma, who's done it. He made use of the methodologies and the frameworks that we provided to them in the TEEP framework, and his own company's initiative in this has been a spearhead in this direction. And here is the first disclosure that they made of their externalities. Literally, by business division, by the supply chain, by product, he knows how much his company has impacted society. He makes 250 million euros of profits. The cost is some 145 million euros. That's not a good thing. He wishes to reduce it. But the first thing is, let's find out how much. He's done that. Measuring externalities is the first step towards disclosing them the first towards solving them. But unfortunately, despite models of success, whether it's in taxation or finance or advertising or externalities, we still have too many of what I call Corporation 1920. Corporation 1920, by the way, because Dodge versus Ford, that famous case, was in 1919. Ever since then, we've known what we have. This is what Milton Friedman said. There is only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game. Which means, who cares for externalities? That's quite interesting, actually. For a Nobel Prize-winning economist to ignore externalities is quite odd, but he did. And this, unfortunately, remains the majority view, that CSR is really about making sure that your company does well. There are other views, thankfully. Here's the view of Jamshedji Nusarwanji Tata, the founder of the Tata Group, who says, in a free enterprise, the community is not just another stakeholder in business, but is, in fact, the very purpose of its existence, a corporation with social purpose. Here's what Jochen Zeitz says. We need to move out of the area of business that causes collateral damage, using a phrase from military, that causes collateral damage, to business that causes collateral benefits. Jochen Zeitz, another different view of the corporation. And here's what I think tomorrow's corporation, what I call Corporation 2020, has to be. It has to be a social corporation, one with social purpose. Goals aligned with society. It has to be a capital factory. Sure, create financial capital. That's part of your job. It's not that I'm against profits. It's like this. In order to exist, a corporation has to make profits. In order to breathe, in order to live, I have to breathe. But breathing is not my purpose. In the same way, making profits is not just the corporation's purpose. It's more than that. It's delivering value to society. So creating positive externalities has not got to be an exception that happens sometimes. It has to be the way forward. That has to be the norm, not the exception. And in the process of doing that, you will find corporations becoming institutes of learning, creating human knowledge and skills that enables people to earn more, create human capital. You will find other corporations actually becoming communities, engendering links with society, with customers, with suppliers, and with the community at large. You will find corporations becoming custodians of natural capital rather than locusts, planetary locusts which consume it. And once again, am I talking theory? No. There are leadership examples in each one of these categories, and let me just give you one of each. A corporation as an institute, Infosys, in India. This company hires something like 30,000 trainees every year. Most of them are trained in this campus, which at any one point has at least 20,000 people, 5,000 teachers and 15,000 students. 6 months of intensive training. This one campus in a tiny city of Mysore in India produces more IT engineers, is the third largest producer of IT engineers after the US of A and the People's Republic of China. And many of these leave, and with them leaves the knowledge and the skills and the brand that they've got. That earning that they create outside of Infosys is positive externalities, benefits to other companies and to society and to other countries. And we've actually measured them. The answer was $1 to $1.2 billion per annum of positive human capital externalities for a company that's basically a $6 billion turnover company. So that gives you a sense of scale of positive externalities on the human capital side. And here's a community, Natura, a company in Brazil. Basically, Brazil's largest producer of cosmetics, but this one is unusual, not just because its cosmetics have in the case of the composition, 80% of natural molecules as against the average 40, but because this company believes in engaging the society within which it works. It has no shops. This is a $3.5 billion corporation with no shops and basically sells cosmetics. And how does it do so? By engaging what it calls consultants, who are mainly housewives, and these housewives earn something of the order of $1.3 billion of commissions. So we're talking about an average $1,000 per household of additional earning by the housewife, which does many positive things, changes the male-female balance in the family, gives that self-confidence to the woman, gives her skills which she can apply to other products, including, interestingly, competitors' products, or Boticario. It gives flexibility in the labor market because that's 1.4 million employees who don't appear on any headcount or statistic. And finally, it creates the positive link between communities and societies, which you need. In other words, transactions happen with less costs and more effectiveness. So there are huge positive externalities here in this community model of the company. In summary, therefore, we do need to deliver a new social contract. The means for us to do so are here. We have, in the case of to achieve accountable advertising, the need to engage advertising associations to be able to change the rules, as indeed the European Cosmetics Association has already done, rules for what is right and wrong advertising. We need to get the central banks in play in order to get rules on leverage. Leverage is a risk. It is a risk on third parties unless you are accountable for your capital and your losses. But we need to get them to limit leverage in many different ways. It's not just consortium limits. It can be due to capital adequacy norms, and there are other forms of doing so. Resource taxation is a must. Tax bases are in any case declining across the European world and in G20 countries. And we need to move away from the era where we are just taxing profits and salaries, in other words, ingenuity and hard work, and are starting to tax not the goods but the bads, which is resource extraction and resource use. And finally, we have to absolutely measure and disclose externalities so that people like you and me can respond and say, okay, is this company better or that? Let's look at its full report, its 3D P&L report. These are the things that need to change. Interestingly, there are examples of this already happening. There are leaders, but what's missing is followers. So what we need to do is to bridge this gap between leadership and followership. That's what will engender change. That's what will deliver a new social contract. It's in our hands to drive it, but it's also in the hands of these different groups of regulators to ensure that the football field is tilted flat and not this way, so that the leaders can have followers. With that, we will have, in my opinion, a new social contract. Thank you.